Welcome back to the Critical Thinking Tools podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 2, Correlation and Cause. This episode is about the fact that when you do have a correlation between variables, that does not mean there is a cause. It could be a spurious correlation, reverse causation could be in play, and when you have a correlation, you just do not know what is causing what. This is why in psychology and medicine, experiments are so important. Because when you randomly assign people into groups, you become more sure that you are establishing cause because you're changing one variable and seeing if it affects the other variable. In science in general, there are a few different factors that you need before you know that one thing is causing the other. You need to know that there is a correlation, and you have to double check that there's a correlation. You've got to check that when you control for other variables, there's still a correlation. It's actually a big task to establish that there is a correlation to start with. If there's no correlation, there's no cause. And believe it or not, some people do believe that some things are causing other things, even when there's no correlation in the scientific literature. The second thing that you need to establish to know a causal relationship is there is that the cause must come before the effect. It sounds obvious, but you have to carefully think through or carefully measure whether one variable is happening and then another variable is changing. And the third thing to establish cause is that you have to be sure that a correlation is not a spurious correlation. In other words, you have to rule out third variables that could be causing both variable A and variable B. You have to rule out a possible dozen other possible causes. You have to control the variables, and you have to check as part of this search to find out whether it's a spurious correlation. You have to check whether if you change one variable in something like an experiment or a natural experiment or something like that, if you change one variable, the other variable must change afterwards. That is what helps us estimate whether one variable is causing another. Now, this is extraordinarily important to think about in every single aspect of your life as you're assessing claims in medicine. If you're thinking about doing this treatment in medicine, or if you're thinking about doing this treatment in psychology, you're thinking about what to believe about how politics works, you're thinking about what to believe about how economics works, you're deciding what to do in your business. You need to understand how to carefully assess whether one thing is causing another. This is best illustrated with a lot of examples. In fact, what I've just said may have lost some listeners because there's no examples in the first part of this podcast. So let's get into examples. One of the most illustrating examples of this idea that correlation does not equal cause is the real correlation of ice cream sales in a city correlating with the number of murders in a city. All right, so what the human brain usually does when we see two things that are happening at the same time, one is going up and then the other one is going up, we assume cause. This is what the human brain is evolved to do in nature. When we see two things happening together, it's probably a good idea in our hunter-gatherer lifestyle to maybe just assume cause. Sometimes it causes a problem in our understanding of the world, but usually it works really well to associate the rustling of the bushes with a possible predator. That probably works in our survival. However, it can be very costly today when we're dealing with psychology, medicine, politics, economics, and so on. All right, let's get back to the example. It is true that in a city, ice cream sales correlate with murders in the city. Okay, so does that mean that ice cream sales are causing murders, or that murders are causing ice cream sales, or anything like that? I'll let you think about that for a second. Of course, this is an absurd correlation, but it's a true one. And in fact, the reason why you might be seeing ice cream sales going up as murders goes up is probably something to do with a third variable, like the heat of the summer may be antagonistic to people, or Just this fact that in the summer, people get out more, interact more, argue more because they're interacting, and arguments can lead to murders and so on. Interactions can lead to murders in a very small minority of interactions. So that's probably the real cause. However, just imagine if you were not a good critical thinker and as a politician you saw this relationship and you said, okay, I think we need to reduce ice cream sales because every time the ice cream sales go up, murders go up. Do you understand how much money that would waste? How many lives would be lost because of this redirection of attention away from real causes? And this is an absurd example, but I only picked it because it would be obvious to a student that this is not a real relationship. However, with some of the correlations that you see in psychology, medicine, politics, they are spurious correlations that are not causal. However, they're much more difficult to detect because they're less implausible. I mean, it's implausible to anybody's mind that ice cream sales would cause murders. So what do you do when you have a correlation like this? Well, you think logically through it in this way. First of all, you think there may not be a correlation really. It may be just a bad study, bad statistics. So I'm going to go and check the literature. So you look at all the past research on ice cream sales and murders. And then if you find a correlation, then you move on to the next step, to thinking about whether it's causal. If you do not find a correlation because the claimed correlation is not even there when you test it, you abandon the idea that ice cream sales are causing murders, right? So that if you don't find a correlation, that's it. That's the end of it. If you do find a correlation, you move on to the next step and you start thinking very carefully. You know that correlations do not equal cause. So you start thinking about third variables, you start thinking about reverse causation. So you think about it this way, and you start thinking about mechanisms as well, plausible mechanisms. Okay, so you start thinking, is the sugar rush that you get from ice cream sales, could that sugar rush possibly cause people to commit more murders? And you evaluate that and say there's some plausibility there, but I don't think that's very high. So you kind of have that as a question mark in your mind. And then you think about reverse causation. You think, okay, so there's a correlation. Maybe, could it be B causing A rather than A causing B? So you start to think to yourself, could it be that when murders go up in a city, that causes people to be so upset that they go out and buy ice cream? And again, it's this kind of low-level plausible explanation that, you know, this is difficult to test experimentally, so you have to think through these mechanisms. But it kind of makes sense that murders in a city would get into the news and then people would go out and buy ice cream, but it's not actually a high plausible mechanism in your mind. So you just kind of hold it in your mind. And the skill to critical thinking is holding things in your mind and not committing to them. And then you think about other plausible explanations, like what about the heat? Is it true that heat causes irritation? Well, you could look at the literature on that, and if you do find past experiments showed aggression comes out of heat and it's not a spurious correlation, then you hold that as maybe having a little bit more plausibility than the idea of a sugar rush or that murders cause ice cream sales. So heat in your mind's eye is just a little bit more plausible. And then you think about another factor that is, during the summer heat, people get outside more, they interact more, they are involved in talking to each other more, they're involved in bumping into each other more, and maybe it's that social interaction which maybe causes murders to go up during the summer. And that one in your mind really does feel the most plausible one out of all four. But you move away from this difficult problem thinking maybe it's heat, maybe it's social interactions that causes the murders to go up in the summer. And I'm never sure because we haven't done the experiment, but in terms of a policy view, as a politician, you would be very doubtful about ice cream sales being the real cause. And then you would just hold that uncertainty in your mind and not ban ice cream sales. And you notice that we're still coming out of this correlation uncertain about cause, but maybe quite clear that we cannot base policy decisions in such a way to think that ice cream sales are causing murders. because it's not plausible enough. And this is sometimes all you can do in complex problems like this is assess plausibility of cause and effect. Let's take another example that is actually less implausible. So we're going to move away from the implausible example. Let's move on to something, and we're going to take some deliberately controversial topics in this podcast just to get you interested as a student, as a young person, or as anybody who's listening. And I'm not going to come away from it saying, I know as a professor that this is causing this. I'm just going to show you how careful good scientists are about assessing cause, and it explains why we do so much research. Why do we have 100 articles in this area of psychological science? It's because of this problem of it being very difficult to assess cause and effect. Now think about this. In a city, there is a correlation between the number of police in a certain area and the number of crimes in a certain area. Now, believe it or not, that correlation is sometimes interpreted by some people to mean that perhaps a police presence is causing the crime. So this is what some people do when they see a correlation. They see that high police presence is correlating with high crime, and then use their political orientation to then choose one of their favorite cause and effect relationships. So some people will choose without much thought that police presence is causing crime, and then the solution to this would be to defund the police, to remove the police interactions, and then crime would go down. And this is a very empirical claim that can be tested. Now, but think about it logically, just like you would with any boring correlation. This is an interesting correlation, but think about it in any correlation you see in science, in politics, in economics. Okay, so first of all, you do the same thing. You test vigorously to see if there is an actual correlation, because it could be nonsense. It could be just made up that there's this correlation. But let's say that you scan the literature, you look at the best evidence, and you do find that high police presence is correlated with high crime areas, right? Then you think about, okay, so what's the plausibility that the police could be antagonizing individuals to such an extent that they are causing crime? Okay, well, you think about that, and it has kind of some plausibility to it, doesn't it? But then you go on to the next step and you think, what about reverse causation? So always think about reverse causation. Then you think, is it possible that high crime areas are causing more police to be present? Now, this is very plausible, isn't it? Right? So that is probably a large effect. It stands to reason that if crimes go up in an area, it places a demand on government services to increase police presence there, and even individuals living in that area will be requesting more police presence, especially those who don't commit crimes themselves. So as you can see, as you go through this thought process, your certainty that police are causing crime diminishes as you think it through, right? So you become less of a certain individual who just knows, and you become an activist because you just know that this is causing this, and then you become more reflective and say, oh yeah, maybe crime is causing police presence to go up. But you don't necessarily rule out the possibility that police mistreatment might be antagonizing some crime as well. You understand that you can have a multi-causal system where high crime may be the biggest cause of police presence, but police mistreatment might also antagonize crime, maybe to a lesser extent, but again, I'm not even sure of that, and you should not be certain either. And then you go on to the next stage of examining variables. You think, what about third variables? What about the amount of money available to households in the high crime area? Maybe that lack of money is causing the crime, maybe more than the police presence is causing the crime. So you start thinking about third variables. You start thinking about, what about attitudes towards property within the community, attitudes towards earning money? All of these attitudes and cultural norms within a community might cause higher crime in certain areas, and then that cultural set of beliefs, then after it's caused the crime, it attracts the police in to reduce crime. So there may be another 12 possible causes of crime that I'm not thinking about. For example, one that comes to mind is maybe fatherlessness in that community is leading to a higher percentage of individuals committing crimes because they're not getting two parents giving them guidance during important years on how to be a person, how to succeed in life without committing crime. And then that variable of fatherlessness may be leading to higher crime. And then when that higher crime comes in, police are brought in. And then maybe there is a complex interaction between those who are fatherless and their response to authority, may be creating an antagonistic relationship with authority figures as well. So you should come away from all of this saying to yourself, honestly, I'm not sure what is causing what, and whether there's a web of causes here. And therefore, because I'm not sure, I'm going to carefully balance out the plausibility of each cause and make sensible decisions. And also not only make sensible decisions, but know that I may be wrong in trying to evaluate a cause, such that if I, as a politician, create a new approach to crime in an area, if I know that I may be wrong because correlation is not cause, then after 6 months of that trial, I understand that if it does not work, I may have been wrong about evaluating one of the variables. For example, if in Minnesota, let's say, you decide to have a campaign to defund the police, and then you see murders go up in the city, you should be in this mindset of not knowing for sure what is causing what. You should be so open-minded to being wrong about causes that you change the program as soon as you see crime going up or after a trial period. And then you revisit it and take an empirical approach and then reverse course and then see if crime goes down. So this is how complex these real ecologically valid problems in society are. So we're dealing with individuals with billions of neurons making decisions. We're dealing with perhaps 30 different causes in a system. And I would hate to see young students coming out of university sure that cause A is causing effect B in situations like this. Okay, let's move on to another controversial subject, and this time into my area of study. So what about the correlation between traumatic experiences and a measure called dissociation? Let's think it through, just like we did with the other variables. So traumatic experiences can be measured by people filling out a form and documenting how many traumas they have been through in life, and the traumatic experiences scale can measure that. It's not easy to measure. There's going to be a lot of fuzziness in that measure, but at least you can measure it. And on the other hand, dissociation is a proposed concept in which we feel disconnected from ourselves, perhaps as a result of trauma. We feel depersonalized, cut off from emotions, perhaps related to trauma. And we also have gaps in memory, according to the theory of dissociation. Some people believe that those gaps in memory may be dissociative amnesia, in which we're protecting ourselves from past experiences. And also, people who are high on dissociation tend to get absorbed into new experiences. They can tend to be a little bit suggestible, very imaginative. So this is the idea of what dissociation is. And it comes from a theory from physicians in the 1800s who believed that trauma caused dissociation, such as Pierre Janet, Jean-Martin Charcot, and Sigmund Freud. So this is an old theory. And there is a measure for dissociation called the dissociative experiences scale. All right, so you have this theory proposed by 19th century thinkers that trauma causes dissociation. You think it through in the same way as a scientist. You think, okay, is there really a correlation, right? So you really have to focus down on that. So you measure traumatic experiences, perhaps with the traumatic experiences scale. But when you do so, you evaluate how good that scale is, right? So you critique whether it's actually measuring traumatic experiences and so on, right? And then you measure dissociation. And so you might use something like the dissociative experiences scale. But you also critique, when you're looking at these correlations, of how good a measure is this scale, all right? So you question everything. And then you use the scales that you think might be the most objective in measuring trauma on the one hand and dissociation on the other. And then you actually look to see if there is a correlation, and you test to see whether past research has exaggerated the correlation for some reason. And then you question whether one is causing the other, right? So you do it this way. First of all, you evaluate the correlation, and given the research, as far as what I have seen, that the correlation between trauma and dissociation is actually quite low. A correlation of about R equals 0.2 is what I seem to recall in one or two of the studies, 0.3, 0.4, something like that. And then you start to think, could it be that trauma is causing dissociation? Well, first of all, there is a correlation, but it's low, so it's obviously not the cause. You know, it's not a large cause of it, but maybe it's a small cause of it, okay? You think about the plausibility of it, you know, so could stressful events, traumatic events, affect the way that you answer questions on a dissociation scale? So in other words, could traumatic experiences lead you to feel more disconnected from yourself compared to somebody who's not traumatized? And I think there is some plausibility there, isn't there? Obviously, it's not a one-to-one relationship because the correlation is low, but you start to think, yeah, maybe there is something causal in that direction. Stress, trauma leads to people perhaps with more gaps in their memory too. Now, that might be because of prolonged stress affects memory and so on. And maybe people who've been traumatized also tend to be very imaginative too. I'm not so sure about that one. But you can see I'm talking through the plausibility of these mechanisms because we're not really allowed to do an experiment in which we randomly assign people to be traumatized and then measure their feelings of dissociation later. So we're not really allowed to do that, so we have to think through mechanisms. But then you think, what about reverse causation? Could it be that people who answer highly on a dissociative scale, so they're more likely to over-endorse feelings of being disconnected, those type of people who are going to over-endorse it, are they also going to over-endorse trauma on a traumatic experiences scale? And that is quite plausible too. So you could imagine that there is a group of individuals in a clinic who've all been told the theory that trauma causes dissociation. Those individuals are likely to score themselves high on the dissociation scale, and they may also be so inclined, due to their learning about the theory, to score themselves high on the traumatic experiences scale. So, in other words, this correlation could be coming out of beliefs in people who are being taught about this relationship. So beliefs in the individuals could be a cause, which, if it is a cause, then the relationship between trauma and dissociation may actually be even smaller than the 0.3 that I talked about earlier. And then you think about other causes too, and you hold in mind that maybe a third variable, such as the shrinkage of the hippocampus that comes from prolonged stress or prolonged trauma over a long period of time, that could be the real cause of diminished cognitive ability in memory, diminished feelings of wholeness. So in other words, you may feel more disconnected every now and again if your mind has been under stress for a long time due to the long-term effects of prolonged stress on the cognitive system. So your cognitive system is just less together than somebody who has not been stressed over time. So this could be a third variable. As you come away from this inner dialogue of trying to assess cause and effect in the relationship between trauma and dissociation, you come out of it with some uncertainty. This is the same message all along. You don't know for sure what is causing what, but you do know some things, right? So if the correlation is 0.3, you know that it's not a one-to-one relationship. So in other words, you cannot work backwards from somebody with a high score on dissociation. You cannot conclude that they must have trauma, and then because we know that they must have trauma, let's go dig in with recovered memory therapy to try and uncover that trauma. No, that's very wrong. There are so many exceptions with a low correlation that you cannot conclude from one variable anything about the other variable, unless the correlation is so high and you know that it's a causal relationship. Now let's talk about another example, just to bring it home, how every discussion of a topic in psychology always can be broken down into cause and effect. And whether you believe that one thing is the cause or another really changes your perspective. So the disagreement of what is causing what in psychology leads to factions really disagreeing with one another. Let's take the example of decompensation in therapies that deal with trauma reliving. This is something that is actually observed in the world, that those individuals that go through therapy that recovers traumas sometimes get worse. They decompensate over time, and that correlation, if it does exist, needs to be checked that it exists to start with. But if it does exist, and you see this in the literature, if there is a correlation, you move on to the next step. You start to think, is the therapy causing the decompensation? Does the therapy of reliving trauma or digging for old trauma, does it come before the decompensation? And that seems quite plausible, because you do have the therapy happening first and over time, and then you see the decompensation, the reduction in functioning come after some time in many cases. And then you might ask yourself, okay, so does that also correlate with increased pharmaceutical use to help deal with the upcoming trauma or the depression that may come from reliving traumas? So you think about it that way. So does the time series make sense? In other words, did the therapy come before the decompensation? Well, yeah, that's kind of plausible. And then you think, is it possible that the decompensation caused the need for trauma therapy? Now that's possible too. So you have to carefully analyze whether the person decompensated and then had trauma therapy and then recovered. So you have to have an open mind about that. And then you start to think, okay, what about third variables? Could it be something like the trauma therapy is leading to false memories of trauma? And because those false memories of trauma are new, they have a negative effect on the person. It's devastating for the person to come to believe that they were abused when they did not know before. And then that's causing a reduction in functioning, decompensation, and an increase in pharmaceutical use. And again, you come out of all of this not as a zealot who thinks they know what is causing what, but as somebody who's carefully evaluated possible plausible causes, because you should be holding the cause and effect relationship very tentatively in your mind. You're ready to change it when evidence comes up. So you should never be dogmatic about just thinking that you know what is causing what in complex systems. Now let's move on to another final topic that's extraordinarily controversial and interesting, but I want to deliberately use these controversial ideas to get you interested in thinking about cause and effect, right? So what about the proposed correlation between negative attitudes towards minor attractive persons, or paedophiles in other words? So these are individuals who may or who may not have offended, but they report being sexually attracted to children, which is a morally reprehensible behavior if they were to act it out, right? But what about the proposed correlation that seems to be coming up in recent literature between negative attitudes towards pedophiles and paedophilia? How do you deal with this proposed correlation? Again, you just use the same tools that I've been talking to you about. First of all, and primarily, you check whether there really is a correlation. The proposed correlation is that negative attitudes in society isolate individuals who are attracted to children in such a degree that they are more likely to offend because they're so isolated. They're not getting advice, they're isolated by these negative attitudes. The primary thing you must do is check to see if there is a correlation. So you look at past research, you do thought experiments in your mind comparing those countries with more positive attitudes towards paedophilia compared to those with very negative attitudes to paedophilia, and you check whether those countries with the negative attitudes, the very high negative attitudes, do they actually have more paedophilia? It's a very questionable correlation, isn't it? And then you have to also question, even if it is a correlation, is that particular variable of negative attitudes something that we should even consider changing? Why not look at other causes and change those causes? Anyway, so let's take it step by step. Carefully check to see if there is a correlation. Now, in this particular case, I am very suspicious that there is actually not a correlation, and that needs checking, because I cannot think that it always applies that there's a correlation between negative attitudes as a cause or a minor cause of paedophilia. Because if you think about the tribe in Papua New Guinea called the Sambia tribe, in which boys as young as age 7 are removed from their mothers and undergo an initiation rite involving oral sex on the adult men. The tribe that's isolated from Western civilization, that has less negative attitudes towards adult and child sexual contact. You can see that the child sex contact in that society, that tribe, is 100%. However, in the UK, with all of these negative attitudes towards paedophilia, the rates of child-adult sexual contact is much lower. Even doing this simple thought experiment is giving me pause to think that there is an actual correlation between negative attitudes and paedophilia. So that gets me thinking, okay, if there's no real correlation, maybe it's possible that there must be something else going on, such as another causal relationship that the recent researchers on MAPs have not been thinking about. For example, there may be a causal relationship in the other direction. In other words, is it plausible that negative attitudes towards paedophilia actually reduces paedophilia because it's a deterrent? Now, that is very plausible too. And you have to ask yourself, how big is that effect? So how many hundreds of thousands of children are being saved from sexual contact with adults because of negative attitudes? Now, in this particular example, we're not actually sure that there is a correlation. But if you were to go on investigating this and you did find a correlation, then you would go through all the next steps that we talked about before. You would check for third variables, check about the plausibility of mechanisms, you would think about reverse causation, and measure many different possible explanatory variables as well. So that was a very controversial topic, as were some of the other examples, but I hope this podcast really brought home to you how much harm could be prevented when you come across these very important topics, and apply a careful evaluation of causes without rushing to judgment on what is causing what. Actually figuring out real cause and effect in psychology, medicine, politics, economics, and all of these important areas of thought helps prevent harm. And knowing how to think like this will probably help you prevent harm in yourself and in those around you, and help you thrive as a person out in the world, as a critical thinker. And I will talk to you next time.